Greetings, mammals, and welcome back to the 10,000 Heroes Show. I'm your host, Ankur Shah Delight. This show is about being the species we want to see in the world, based on that Gandhi quote that he never actually made, but everybody loves. So we're here to explore what you, me, and 9,998 of our friends can do to make progress on personal enlightenment, world peace, and everything in between. The concept I want to present today, I call the 6 dimensions of conflict, and it comes up in chapters 2 and 3 of a book called The Crossroads of Conflict by Ken Cloke. And if you've noticed, I've been reading this book for a while because it's super intense. And when I met with Ken at the beginning of this year, he gave me 3 books to read by him and 3 books to read by Bill Urey. And so I read the one by Bill Urey, did a podcast about it recently, and this is the one I'm reading by him. But man, it is intense going and amazing, but I feel like I have to do something like this on basically every chapter, every couple of pages just to digest it. So thank you, Ken. Okay, so what's going on in this one is that he has a model where he breaks down conflict and kind of undefines it and how we approach it into 6 areas. And then he looks at that sextet of conflict areas from 4 different angles. And I find it very illuminating. So that's why I'm going over it. So the first angle he looks at it, he calls the orders of resolution. And so the way I translate that is like, these are the different ways that conflict can be resolved, or the different desires for resolution that may or may not be present. So Ken says the 6 orders of resolution are: 1, stopping the fighting. So this is actually like physical altercation, war on a grander level, or a fist fight on a more personal level. So de-escalation, stopping the actual fighting. Number 2, settling the issues that are at stake. So that's like whatever the conflict is about. So if I've been observing these divorce mediations and parenting plans and commercial mediations. So whatever the conflict that brings people to the table, just settling the issue. 3 is resolve the underlying reasons for the conflict. And the idea is that, then they won't be back next week with another conflict because the underlying needs have been met. And that's the shift that Bill Urey and that whole generation and movement brought us from positional bargaining to actually being like, well, what do you people want here? That's going from just settling the issues to this number 3 of resolving the underlying reasons. And then there's 3 more, but I'll just say, and this will come up multiple times in today's episode, the first 3 and the second 3 are very different. And the first 3 are really, I would say, easy to grasp for most people, why it's important to do. And the second 3 are a little bit more ephemeral and maybe harder to see how it's possible or why it's important. I don't know. I mean, I think for me, it's all very evident why it's important, but they're just a little bit higher level in a way. So the first 3, again, were de-escalation, settling the issues, and resolving the underlying reasons. And then the second 3, starting with number 4. Number 4, Ken says, forgive our opponents and ourselves. So going from just like, oh, hey, we resolved the conflict, or we resolved it in such a way that we're not going to get into a conflict again. Number 4 is really like, hits you right in the heart of, okay, forgiveness. And number 5, even further beyond forgiveness, is reconciliation with opponents. And I wasn't clear on the distinction, so I read it multiple times. And I think what that means is, in forgiveness, I've given up my my attachment to what happened in the past, and I'm able to like be in the moment and accept that what happened. With reconciliation, there's an opportunity and a desire to renew the relationship. So it's not just like, all right, you mess with me, I dealt with it, I accept that happened, I forgive you, I never want to see you again. But number 5 is more like, maybe we can have a relationship in a different context. And just, if that's that's triggering for me even to hear. So if that's triggering for you, there's no concept that all of these things have to happen or should happen, or that you're a bad person if you don't want them to happen in every conflict. This is just like what's available. This is the menu of options. So number 4, forgiveness. Number 5, reconciliation. And number 6, design systems that make it more difficult for future conflicts to appear. So this is like looking at the system as a whole and not being like, this is just my conflict, but actually seeing the connections between the internal and the external and the micro and the macro. So I see this in these mediations that I'm doing and that I'm observing. I can see this now every day in all of these different conflicts, how all of these things are present. And sometimes people want to work on, honestly, they want to work on none of them. And sometimes they have enough pressures in their life that they need to work on some of them and they're willing to, but they don't want to work on most of them. And so a lot of the mediations you see, people, they successfully stopped fighting enough to be in the same room, even if it's a Zoom room. And they're really there to settle the issues. And the mediator is there to help them gain interest in resolving the underlying reasons. That's number 3. So they don't have to come back to mediation and do number 2 all over again. And if there can be a little bit of forgiveness, that would be amazing, but that's usually not even on the table, right? So that's what I'm seeing. But Ken is really broadening the perspective into what's possible. And here's a quote from the book. Each of these orders of resolution, like the Richter scale for earthquakes, requires exponentially greater skill and sensitivity than the one beneath it, along with greater integrity, commitment, and permission to proceed on the part of everyone involved. Each takes longer to achieve, goes deeper into the heart of the problem, and permits a different set of issues and resolutions to emerge. Each leaves less of the conflict remaining after it is completed. So for me, the claim is that every conflict has all of that potential in it. Every conflict, every small marital dispute could take us right to the top of the game. Every conflict has the seeds of forgiveness, reconciliation, and total transformation of our society within it. It's all there in every conflict. That's really the claim that I'm getting out of this 6 dimensions of conflict thing from Ken. And it blows my mind because then it's like, okay, I now see every conflict as an opportunity. The key, of course, operationally, like in your life and in the lives of people you work with, if you work like this, is what do you want to get out of it? What does the participant want to get out of it? What does the facilitator want to get out of it? What are you in the kitchen, like screaming at your partner, want to get out of it? And then once you know like what that desire is, which level I want to work on today, and maybe it's just stopping the fighting, which is amazing, as anyone in any one of the numerous conflict regions in the world could tell you, stopping the fighting is a lot. It's nothing to be poo-pooed or dismissed. But once you know what you want, then of course, do you have the skills to get there? That's number 2. So that's the first angle, the 6 dimensions of conflict. And the second angle, he takes a mathematical analogy, which I think is helpful for people who are more visual or geometric thinkers. And basically he maps each of those 6 orders of resolution to an image. And so the first, and this is, I'm going to be doing a lot of hand gestures, which you're not going to see because this is audio, but I can't help myself. So he starts with a total lack of resolution, which is known as impasse, and chooses to represent that as a point. So just imagine a mathematical point in space. And the fun thing about the point, of course, if you're into the math side of things, is it has no dimensions. It's a 0-dimensional space. It's just, it has no width, no breadth, no depth, no size. It's just it's a concept. It's a construct of a place in space. So that's what he calls impasse. And then he goes through the first 3, the 3 that in my mind are easier to grasp as the first 3 dimensions in geometry that you know so well. So the first one is a line, stopping the fighting or de-escalation. So the de-escalation thing is like, all right, suddenly we have this line and we can either be closer together or further apart on this line. That's what he calls the first dimension. And then the second dimension, you then rotate out and move in the other, 90 degrees from the line. You have a plane. So a plane is like a piece of paper that has no depth, right? And this is what he maps to settling the issues or doing bargaining. So you have this space that you can play with. It's not just, am I getting closer or further, but maybe there's one dimension where like, oh, I give you one thing, and another dimension where you give me something else. And that's what he calls them settling the issues. And then the third one, where you like go beyond the issues and resolve the underlying tensions or interests or needs or emotions, which corresponds to finding a win-win and not just like I get something and you don't get it, that he maps to a cube. So we've gone from the impasse or the point to the line, to the plane, to the cube. And what I think is nice about the cube metaphor is that you can see, if you look at the top of the cube, the plane is still there. Like the sheet of paper is still there on the top of the Rubik's Cube. But then there's all this junk beneath it, which is all the junk that has always been beneath it, which is all of our past and our emotions and how we see things and what the conflict ultimately means to us, so we don't quite resolve it at this level. And then, just like he goes from like a one-dimensional object, a line, to a two-dimensional object, a plane, and then a 2D to a 3D, from a plane to a cube, every other order of resolution, so the fourth level, the fifth level, and the sixth level, which correspond to forgiveness, reconciliation, and system thinking or system change, are represented in this geometric metaphor as a higher dimensional object. So as hypercubes, it's a mathematical term. But there's, if you can Google some like images of hypercubes, but basically I can't visualize it. I don't know. I mean, maybe some people can, but I think most people have trouble visualizing things in more than 3 dimensions. So for me, like the utility of the geometric analogy kind of breaks down because I can't visualize it. But what's interesting about it is that these 3 dimensions of resolution, we just see them less, and they're harder to imagine when you're in a conflict. Really, I think for most people at the level of consciousness we're at, even getting beyond settling the issues to resolving the underlying emotions, even going from 2 to 3, is a big stretch. And so being able to keep perspective wide enough to realize that forgiveness and reconciliation and the total transformation of our culture and society are always on the table is very hard to imagine, just like imagining a 4, 5, or 6 dimensional object is hard to imagine. So there's an interesting parallel there. They just seem magical and fantastical, like Encanto.
All the people are fantastical and magical.
But of course, they're actually right around the corner. Right around the corner, if you listen to Ken. All right, which you should. I mean, we all should. All right, so angle number 3. So we went over the orders of resolution. We went over the math part of it. And then the third one is like, where are these conflicts located in the body, in a way? So he then takes these 6 orders of resolution, 6 areas of conflict, and then maps them to the body. So of course, stopping the fighting, the de-escalation, is mapped to the physical body. And this, this is going to lead to how he proposes working on it in the kind of the 4th angle. So stopping the fighting is in the physical body, settling the issues, the problem solving or engineering part, is in the mind, resolving the underlying reasons of the conflict are kind of the emotional body. Forgiveness, the 4th one, is he calls it the energetic or spiritual part. Those words are just, they're used for a lot of things. And when I was thinking about this show, I'm thinking, how do I make this make sense to people who would normally just have like a reflexive vomiting reaction to the word energy? And I think something like attitude gets a similar concept across, where nobody believes that attitude is an actual physical, directly maps to an actual like physical or chemical simple reality in the body. It's really it's like an emergent property of a lot of different things that are going on. And so I think you can see like energy or life force in a similar way, that it definitely exists in the sense that we have it and the shape of it is always changing, but it doesn't correspond one-to-one to something you could see under a microscope, at least not that I'm aware of. So level 4, energetic or attitudinal, and that is that corresponds to the forgiveness, or basically your relationship to the past. Level 5 places in the heart, and that's a reconciliation, renewing of relationship. And level 6, of course, the location is no longer in the individual body, but in the social body, in the system around us, and that's the conflict system design aspect. So that's like another dimension that he's adding on to this. Is the first part is like, okay, these are these 6 desires people might have when getting into conflict, the orders of resolution. Then there's like the mathematical analogy. And then there's like, okay, where do each of these 6 things live if we wanted to map them onto our mind-body complex? And then what that gives rise to is the mediation style and the techniques and the style of the conflict resolution. Person doesn't have to be a mediator. Could just be you talking to your kids. Really depends on where the conflict is located and what you want out of the conflict. Like the conflict is this restaurant. You're like, oh, what do I want on the menu of this conflict? So as my flute teacher, Chandra Bose, one of my most incredible flute teachers and people I've ever met, lives in this beautiful small town in Kerala. He would always tell me, well, if you really want to play the flute, you have to be capable of playing any song in any key on any flute, even though these bamboo flutes were made to be played in a specific key. And and then he would just demonstrate by doing the most absurdly difficult and complex things on the most simple flute. So similarly, someone who's well equipped with conflict would be able to have tools to address the conflict in each of these places whenever they come up, which is Ken, right? Ken is that bamboo flute player for conflict, of course. So then he goes through in this like very thorough fashion and outlines how each conflict location gives rise to a certain style of addressing it, and then shares all these common patterns and techniques, getting into very granular detail that I can't go into now about ways that you would implement each style. So I'll just give the 6 styles, and if you want all the details, you have to read the book. So the style that he calls is appropriate for that first level of conflict, where it's really just about stopping the fighting, de-escalation, and the conflict is located in the body. He calls conciliative, and the techniques are really paying attention to body movement, body language, sensory awareness, separating the parties if necessary. And this is all about like ensuring physical safety, right? The second one, where it's more mental, he calls evaluative, and this is all directive, logical, analytical, all aimed at calming people's minds and allowing them to see like logical conclusions or compromise. And this is the part that, of course, appeals to me when I first got into this as the kind of computer science background. But even though, I will say, and I've tried this out on a lot of people at this point, even though this all makes sense and you're speaking to people's minds, I've found that you're almost never only speaking to people's minds. There's just so much emotion and so much attachment to ideas that the idea of like an actually rational discussion is just so, it's almost like a kind of enlightenment. It's just so rare because so much else is going on. And any kind of an idea that comes from an outside party is usually rejected. So it has to be done through a Socratic process of inquiry where the person comes up with it themselves. Otherwise, almost like a antibody response to a foreign agent, it will be rejected. So that's a little personal caveat, even when speaking to the mind. The third style, when you're focused on the emotions, and this is what a lot of the mediation training I've received is called facilitative. And it's really like helping people understand their own needs, their own interests that are behind their positions, which requires a little bit of like relaxing of the grip of the emotions, which you do through listening and empathy, reframing, acknowledgement. And this is incredible. I mean, it's just incredibly powerful the way that these mediations are done, where one party can tell their story to the mediator, looking at the mediator. The other party's in the room, but they're not making eye contact with them. They're just observing. The party's talking to the mediator, sharing their whole like sob story. The mediator is then like reframing and responding in much less partial language, but still accurately reflecting all of the emotions of the first party. And the second party just gets to watch that and get a sense of what the first party is feeling, but without all the blame layers. That can really cause people to melt, and is really, really beautiful. So that's level 3. Level 4, the style is called transformative. And this is really the focus on personal transformation. What does this conflict mean to you? What is your relationship to this conflict doing to you? How is it altering like the future of your life, your own personal responsibility? So of course, this leads to forgiveness and a whole change of relationship with the past. There's this great quote Ken has: "Forgiveness consists of releasing ourselves from the burden of our own false expectations." I'm going to read that again. Forgiveness consists of releasing ourselves from the burden of our own false expectations. So for me, that's like the heart of this number 4 style. Number 5, and this is beyond, I've never done this intentionally, although I think I have had moments like this. Number 5 is called a transcendent style, where it's really based on kind of a heart-to-heart connection, compassionate inquiry, and a super focus on reconciliation. This is where they bring in a lot of mindfulness and wisdom and insight. Again, like Ken was saying, these are exponential in terms of rarity and difficulty. So I haven't experienced a lot of that, but I hope to one day. And I've seen, there's this amazing video. God, I watched it years ago, of a woman, I think it was in Canada, whose child was murdered. Or I don't know if murdered is the right word. Yeah, probably murdered. It was an accident. It was at a party. And through the course of years, she builds a relationship with the person, the perpetrator who did this, and eventually ends up adopting them. And to me, like here's how the logic from the mental side, the logic looks like totally wacky, right? You're like, why would you do that? But from the heart side, it's like she lost a child. Now she has a child. And the person, the offender in this case, like did not have guidance and now has guidance. And so everyone's needs are met. But if you look at it from like the perspective of like, you killed my child, it makes no sense at all. It only makes sense on this other transcendent level that I've read about, but have not personally experienced. So that's level 5. And then level 6, of course, is it's the conflict is in the system itself. And we see ourselves as related to this larger conflict that's taking place all around us. And so it's a system design style where you look at the systemic dysfunctions and what can be altered in the context and the culture and the environment and all that. So those are the 6 dimensions of conflict looked at from 4 angles: the angle of the order of resolution, the math angle, the angle of where it is in the body, and the style that you would take to approach it. But of course, Ken being Ken, universe being universe, as a pragmatist and expert who's been doing this for 40 years, Ken only really advocates one style, which could be described as eclectic, everything, or being in the moment. And this is, I think, what he would encourage us all to do, of course, basically, depending on what people are willing to do, which is going to change from moment to moment, and what we're capable of doing, we should use whatever is the best tool at our disposal at that particular instant. So as I mentioned before, he then gives these like very long lists of specific behaviors and techniques to each style, but I can't get into that right now. The point for me, the conclusion here, is that we can look for each of these levels in every conflict we experience. And we can see what we learn by doing that. And they just reveal themselves to us, and all these possibilities jump out. So if there's an assignment, that's the assignment. It's like, look for this in the next conflict you experience. Look for these 6 levels, see if they're there, see what you learn, see what you're surprised by, and let me know. Because that's what we're here to do, to learn and to grow together. That's it. As always, I'd love to hear from you about most things. The best way to get into contact is to sign up for the newsletter at 10,000heroes.club. That's written out in letters, or UncoreDelight.com, or find me as Encore Shad Delight on LinkedIn and take it from there. You could send me an email and I can respond. Thank you for your time, your intention, and your desire to do something constructive. And remember, the only way out is through.